Biden has been praised by some as a return to normal after Trump. In the administration's own words, they want to restore America's place in the world and be a world leader again. I'm guessing if you signed up for this event, you probably agree that America's leadership has been disastrous for the last several centuries of US imperialism and settler colonialism. Now, as we're seeing, the president is pushing the same old neoliberal status quo. In the face of this brutal economic model and white supremacy in the US, we've had a resurgence of radical anti-capitalist organizing that hasn't been seen since the 60s and 70s. The last decade especially has seen growing mass struggle. Some examples on the slide are, for example, successful burning down of a police station in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd, Occupy Wall Street protests, oil pipeline protests like those ongoing against Line 3, which is an oil pipeline in the upper Midwest that Biden could stop but isn't. The growth of mutual aid and community work, especially after the pandemic, often explicitly pulling from anarchist thinking and tactics. We have the growth of larger organized groups, including trade unions, for example, the Amazon Union campaign in Alabama, political groups like Democratic Socialists of America, Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Socialist Alternative, and political education groups, especially in popular spaces like Instagram. And just even at a broader level, we're seeing an ideological change, especially among young Americans. Polls show as much as 70% are supportive of socialism and over a third of communism. Now, at a militant grassroots level, this trend doesn't show any sign of slowing down under Biden, as we saw in response to the recent racist murder of Daunte Wright in Minnesota and the many protests this week against Israeli invasions of Palestine. While centrist NGOs and the shallow liberal resistance that propped up around Trump may be co-opted, there's something much deeper and more radical growing outside of them. Within this mass organizing, there's a growing anti-imperialist sentiment, with more groups taking this on explicitly. Beyond the more common concern with US military power, our focus today is on a related dimension of US imperialism, which is economics. So what do we mean by economic imperialism? We could define this in a whole lot of ways, but overall, what we want to draw attention to today is a specific set of economic tools used to uphold capitalism in an unequal global economy. These tools are often more formal, subtle, technical rules and policies that are enforced through international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, the World Trade Organization. These instruments are not confronted as directly in the US compared to in the global South, partly because the US military is so large and often the overwhelming focus of anti-imperialist activism in the US. Now, there are a ton of different tools that uphold the neoliberal economic model. You have free trade, which really just means freedom for capital and removing protections that let countries develop their industries. You have debt traps, including loans from rich countries, premised on restructuring the economies and policies of countries they're targeting. You have this kind of hegemony of neoliberal thought that says we should let capital have free reign and denies the possibility of any alternatives. We have food systems based on an unchecked growth of US agribusiness, patenting seeds themselves even, and flooding markets with US goods. We have monetary hegemony of the US dollar, which lets the US economy grow at a crazy rate and gives huge leverage over other countries. We have green imperialism, which can include things like promoting coups and mining liberalization policies to access raw materials in the global South. And we have a global, legally enforceable regime of patents and intellectual property rights, which stifles countries from growing and developing. The end result of all of this is not only strengthening global capitalism, but also cementing a specific neo-colonial relationship between rich countries that were generally colonizing nations like the US, Europe, Japan, often called the global North, and the entire rest of the world, often called the global South. In this relationship, the North extracts resources from the South, like minerals, raw food, labor, in order to keep developing and enhancing their own economies, while pushing a neoliberal economic model that suppresses development alternatives and keeps global South markets open for processed goods from the North. This economic system is confronted sometimes by US activists, but rarely. We have some examples like the 1999 Battle of Seattle against the World Trade Organization, mass campaigns confronting economic sanctions against countries like Venezuela and Cuba, and the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israeli settler colonialism. Now, to wrap up quick, one area as an example where we can see this dynamic clearly is in US trade and investment policy. According to the global North, including the US, the best model for trade is free trade, meaning you remove regulations, remove protections, and let trade flow freely. The problem is this removes protections that are necessary for a whole range of reasons, from protecting growing industries in South countries that need time to develop, guaranteeing a market and livelihood for important national industries, keeping policies that protect the environment or promote women's economic empowerment, All of these things can be targets for liberalization, which allows transnational corporations to come in and do what they want in the name of profit. In his 2021 trade agenda, Biden is explicitly continuing with this formula, even though it's failed for decades. In agriculture, he wants to open export markets for US goods, reduce barriers, and continue with NAFTA 2.0, which wreaked havoc on Mexican agriculture and US working class communities. On the environment, rather than taking responsibility for the US being the #1 polluter, which would look like investing in climate reparations, climate finance according to South countries' demands, and more, instead he wants to confront other polluter nations. For example, a big focus of his environment and trade plan is to go after unregulated fishers in the global South. This is actually a smokescreen that Europe has used too, going after small fishers supposedly in defense of the environment, but actually to guarantee profits for their own large transnational fishing corporations across the world. Lastly, we're receiving a lot of hints that Biden's administration wants to engage with gender and trade. As feminists, we know these issues are connected, but there's been a growing push from the global north to enact more liberalization in the name of reducing barriers to women's economic empowerment. South feminist groups have been opposing this free trade model for decades, which groups like the Gender and Trade Coalition that we're part of have been working to deepen in the face of co-optation. So I hope this gives kind of a quick overview of the context we're in and a sample of why it's important to do these deeper readings of Biden's economic policies and understand what we're up against.